I do not consent to a search of my property.
I don't need your consent.
The Tuesday morning sun was relentless, glinting off the polished chrome of luxury cars and the pristine windows of the high-end boutiques lining Sterling Avenue. This was the city's affluent heart, a place where the grass seemed greener and the air felt cleaner, a carefully curated bubble of wealth and privilege. It was here, amidst the quiet hum of electric sedans and the soft chatter of people stepping out of yoga studios, that Officer Dean Miller decided to make his move. His patrol car, a gleaming Ford Explorer, hugged the curb like a shark cruising the reef. His eyes, shielded by a pair of mirrored aviator sunglasses, scanned the light traffic with a predatory patience. He was 34 years old, with a short, neat brown haircut and a jaw that was perpetually tight with a sense of self-importance. In his crisp blue uniform, he was the self-appointed guardian of this bubble. And then he saw it. An anomaly, a relic, a beat-up sedan, once probably a respectable family car, now painted a faded, slightly sickly shade of yellow. It was an old Crown Victoria, the kind of vehicle that screamed, "Seen better days." It moved with the flow of traffic, signaling correctly, maintaining the speed limit, doing absolutely nothing wrong. But to Miller, it was an intrusion, a dissonant note in the symphony of Sterling Avenue, and the driver sealed the deal. Through the rear window, Miller could see the man's head, clean-shaven and black, a stark contrast to the sea of mostly white faces in the surrounding cars. That was all it took. That was the flicker of justification he needed. He pulled out from the curb, the powerful engine of the Explorer a low growl. He didn't turn on the sirens, not yet. He just closed the distance, tailing the taxi for 2 blocks, his mind already constructing the narrative for his report. Driver appeared hesitant, weaving slightly within the lane, potential for impaired driving. It was a script he knew by heart. Finally, as the taxi signaled to make a right turn onto a quieter, tree-lined side street, Miller flicked the switch. The brilliant strobe of red and blue lights instantly filled his windshield, splashing silently across the back of the yellow cab. The taxi pulled over immediately, smoothly and without fuss, parking perfectly parallel to the curb. There was no sudden braking, no sign of panic, just a professional, calm compliance. For a moment, it almost disappointed Miller. He preferred a little bit of fluster. It made his job easier. He took a deep breath, adjusted his belt, and stepped out of his car. The air was warm, smelling of cut grass from a nearby manicured lawn. He walked with a deliberate, heavy-footed gait, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered firearm. It was a walk designed to communicate authority, to intimidate before a single word was spoken. Inside the cab, the driver watched him approach in the rearview mirror. The man was about 40, his face composed, his eyes steady. He wore a simple light blue button-down shirt under a plain black jacket. There was nothing threatening about him, nothing out of the ordinary, except for the profound stillness he seemed to possess. He didn't fidget or look around nervously. He simply waited. Miller tapped twice on the driver's side window with his knuckle, a hard, impatient rap. The window glided down silently. "License and registration," Miller said, his voice flat and devoid of any greeting. He leaned down slightly, peering into the car, his sunglasses obscuring his eyes and turning his face into an impassive mask of authority. The driver didn't answer immediately. He slowly, deliberately reached over to the glove compartment, his movements calm and visible. He retrieved a small stack of papers and his wallet, placing them on his lap before looking up at the officer. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked. His voice was deep and even, with no trace of fear or anger. It was a simple question, but the way he asked it, calmly, directly, seemed to momentarily throw Miller off his rhythm. "I'll be the one asking the questions," Miller snapped back a little too quickly. "You were drifting in your lane back there. I need to see your license, registration." The trap, so carefully set, so meticulously planned, was now sprung. And Officer Miller had just walked right into it, completely unaware that his entire world was about to be dismantled, piece by humiliating piece, all under the bright, unforgiving morning sun. The cameras, hidden in plain sight, were rolling. The performance had begun. 6 months earlier, the world of Captain Marcus Davis was one of paper, data, and quiet frustration. His office on the 4th floor of the downtown precinct headquarters was neat and organized, a stark contrast to the chaotic reality of police work he was tasked with overseeing. As the head of the Internal Affairs Division, his job wasn't on the streets, it was in the shadows, sifting through the aftermath, trying to find the truth in a hurricane of accusations, denials, and departmental politics. At 42, Davis had the weary eyes of a man who had seen too much of the ugly side of his own profession. He'd been a beat cop, a detective, a sergeant, and he'd loved it. He believed in the badge, in the ideal of protecting and serving. But his current role often felt like being the janitor of the department's soul, cleaning up messes no one wanted to admit existed. For weeks, a file on his desk had been growing thicker, heavier. It was a collection of informal citizen complaints, all originating from the same precinct, the affluent 3rd. And within that precinct, one name kept surfacing like a stubborn weed: Officer Dean Miller. The complaints were disturbingly similar, forming a pattern that was as clear as it was infuriating. There was the complaint from Mr. Alvarez, a professional landscaper who had worked for the same families in the 3rd precinct for over a decade. He was pulled over by Miller for having a suspiciously dirty truck. Miller had questioned him for 45 minutes on the side of the road, implying he was casing the houses he was being paid to beautify, all while his crew sat waiting and his schedule for the day was ruined. No ticket was issued. No formal report was filed. Just a lingering sense of humiliation. Then there was the statement from a young woman, a pharmacy delivery driver who was black. Miller had stopped her for driving too quickly in a residential zone, though her vehicle's GPS data later proved she was going 2 miles under the speed limit. He'd made her empty the contents of her delivery bags onto the hood of his car, questioning her about the prescriptions she was carrying, treating her like a drug runner instead of an essential worker. Again, no ticket, no report. Just a quiet threat and a story that made her request a transfer to a different route. Davis read through a dozen more. A black man in a new BMW pulled over and questioned about how he could afford such a car. A Latino couple stopped while looking for a friend's address, accused of being lost because they didn't look like they belonged. The methodology was always the same. Miller would initiate a stop based on a flimsy, often fabricated pretext: a minor lane drift, a flickering license plate light, a supposed rolling stop. He would then engage in a prolonged, intimidating interrogation designed not to enforce the law, but to remind the person of their place, to make them feel like an outsider, an intruder in his pristine domain. The most damning part was the subtlety. Miller was smart. He never used overt racial slurs, at least not where they could be easily recorded. He operated in the gray areas, using loaded questions and baseless insinuations. He knew the procedure, and he knew how to use it as a weapon. Every stop was, on paper, technically justifiable. Officer observed erratic driving. Initiated traffic stop to ensure driver was not impaired. Driver became defensive. Officer took precautionary measures. It was a masterclass in weaponized bureaucracy. Davis had cross-referenced the complaints with Miller's official activity logs. The officer's stop and search numbers for minorities in the 3rd precinct were nearly 500% higher than any other officer on his shift, despite the area's demographics. The statistical evidence was overwhelming, a giant flashing red light on a data spreadsheet. Yet, data alone wasn't enough. The Departmental Review Board needed more than statistics. It needed concrete, irrefutable proof of intent. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in the silent office. He looked at the photo on his desk, a picture of him and his father, a retired detective who had taught him that the badge was a shield for the public, not a sword against them. What would his father say about an officer like Miller? an officer who was poisoning the well of community trust, one demeaning traffic stop at a time. The system was designed to catch cops who broke the rules, who took bribes or used excessive force. But it was failing to catch the ones who were experts at bending the rules, who used their authority not for public safety, but for personal prejudice. Every complaint that ended in unsubstantiated was a victory for Miller and a defeat for justice. Davis knew this couldn't continue. The echoes of these unheard voices in his file room were growing too loud to ignore. He had to find a way to get a confession, not from Miller's mouth, but from his actions. The problem with catching a snake like Dean Miller was that he was acutely aware of the traps. He wasn't a clumsy, brutish thug. He was a sophisticated predator who understood the ecosystem he inhabited. Captain Davis knew this because he had tried to catch him before, through official channels, and had failed spectacularly each time. It was like trying to nail smoke to a wall. The first official investigation had been launched after the complaint from Mr. Alvarez, the landscaper. Internal Affairs had pulled Miller's body camera footage from the incident. Davis had watched it himself, his jaw clenching tighter with every passing minute. On the video, Miller's voice was a perfect blend of professional courtesy and underlying condescension. He never raised it. He never swore. He used phrases like, "Sir, I just need to verify you have a legitimate reason for being here," and "We've had some reports of property theft in the area, so we're just being extra cautious." To an outsider, or to a review board looking for an easy-to-spot violation, it looked like a cop doing his job. A little overzealous, perhaps, but within the bounds of policy. Miller knew precisely where the camera was and what it could hear. He would often turn his body slightly, creating a plausible reason for the camera to be momentarily obscured during a critical exchange. He would rephrase a citizen's frustrated response in his own report as uncooperative behavior. He would describe a person reaching for their wallet as making a furtive movement. He was a master of the coded language that turned a victim into a potential suspect on paper. When questioned by IA investigators, Miller was the model officer. He sat upright, looked them in the eye, and expressed a calm, rehearsed concern for public safety. "My only goal is to protect the residents of the 3rd Precinct," he would say, his expression one of earnest dedication. "It's one of the safest areas in the city, and I work hard to keep it that way. If that means I have to be more proactive in checking on unfamiliar vehicles or persons, then that's a burden I'm willing to bear." He painted himself as a guardian, a protector, and his accusers as disgruntled individuals who simply didn't like being questioned by the police. Without a smoking gun, his word, the word of a sworn officer, held more weight than that of a landscaper or a delivery driver. The investigation was closed, unsubstantiated. Davis had tried a different tactic next. He had assigned a 2-man surveillance team, discreet, experienced detectives from his own unit, to shadow Miller for a week. They were to observe his patrol patterns and document any questionable stops. The effort was a complete bust. Miller, with the sixth sense of a man who knows he's being watched, was a textbook officer for the entire week. He was courteous to a fault. He helped an elderly woman change a tire. He gave a friendly warning to a teenager who was speeding. He didn't make a single stop of a minority driver for the entire 7 days. He knew he was under scrutiny and simply put on a show. The moment the surveillance was lifted, the informal complaints started trickling in again. The man was insulated. He had the unspoken support of the blue wall of silence, that informal code where officers protect their own, even the questionable ones. Other cops on his shift might have seen or heard things, but no one was going to rat out a fellow officer and risk being labeled a traitor. Miller was also careful to maintain a good relationship with his direct supervisor, a sergeant who saw Miller's high stop numbers not as a sign of prejudice, but as evidence of proactive policing. In the stats-driven world of modern law enforcement, Miller looked like a go-getter. Davis realized the fundamental flaw in his approach. He was trying to use the system to catch a man who had perfected the art of manipulating that very system. Every tool at his disposal, body cameras, official interviews, surveillance, was useless because Miller knew they were coming. He anticipated them, planned for them, and neutralized them with his performance. Miller's racism wasn't a bonfire, it was a toxic, invisible gas that only the victims could feel choking them. To prove it existed, Davis couldn't be an observer. He couldn't send in another cop. He had to get close enough to feel it himself. He had to become the kind of person Miller would never suspect. The kind of person Miller felt free to torment because he believed they were powerless, voiceless, and utterly outside the protection of the system he represented. The officer wasn't just untouchable from the outside, he was untouchable by anyone who looked and acted like a cop. To catch him, Davis would have to stop being one. The idea came to Captain Davis not in a flash of inspiration, but as a slow, creeping realization born from pure desperation. He was sitting in his office late one evening, the city lights twinkling beyond his window, the Miller file open on his desk. He'd just read another complaint, this one from a black architect who was taking photos of a historic building in the 3rd Precinct when Miller detained him for an hour, convinced he was a vandal. The architect was articulate, wealthy, and furious, yet his story was just one more drop in an ocean of unsubstantiated claims. The system had failed again. Davis slammed the file shut. Every official avenue was a dead end. Every attempt to investigate Miller from within the department had been expertly parried. Miller was a ghost in the machine, and the machine itself was protecting him. It was then that the thought, insane and radical, began to form. If you can't observe the predator in his natural habitat without him knowing, then you have to become the prey. The risks were enormous. If he were to go undercover himself, and it went wrong, the fallout would be catastrophic. He could be accused of entrapment, a career-ending allegation. He could be seen as a rogue captain, undermining the very chain of command he was supposed to uphold. If Miller recognized him, the entire operation would become a monumental embarrassment. And there was the physical risk. He would be putting himself in a vulnerable position with an officer known for his aggressive and unpredictable behavior, with no immediate backup. It was a crazy, reckless plan, and he knew with a sinking feeling of certainty that it was the only option he had left. The next morning, he called his most trusted subordinate into his office. Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins was a sharp, no-nonsense detective who had been with IA for 5 years. She was fiercely loyal to Davis and shared his deep-seated frustration with officers who dishonored the badge. She was one of the few people he knew he could trust with something this sensitive. He closed the door, a rare move that immediately signaled the gravity of the conversation. "Sarah," he began, skipping the usual pleasantries, "I want to talk to you about Officer Miller, off the record." Jenkins took a seat, her expression serious. "What about him, Captain? Another complaint we can't make stick?" "Worse," Davis said. "The system can't touch him. We've tried everything by the book. Miller knows the book better than we do. He uses it as a shield." He paused, letting the weight of his statement hang in the air. "So I'm going to throw the book away." He then laid out the plan. His plan. He would go undercover. He would become a taxi driver, the kind of person Miller felt entitled to harass. He would create a situation where Miller felt safe, unobserved by official eyes, and he would let the officer's true nature reveal itself. He would be the bait, the target, and the chief witness all at once. Jenkins listened intently, her face unreadable. When Davis finished, she was silent for a full minute, her eyes searching his, gauging his resolve. Davis expected her to object, to tell him it was too risky, to try and talk him out of it. Instead, she leaned forward. "Entrapment will be the first thing they scream," she said, her voice low and analytical. "The union lawyers will have a field day." "It's not entrapment," Davis countered, his voice firm. "Entrapment is coercing someone to commit a crime they wouldn't otherwise commit. I'm not going to ask Miller to be a racist. I'm just going to give him the opportunity to do what he's already been doing to dozens of other people. The only difference is, this time the victim will be recording." "And if he recognizes you?" Jenkins pressed. "Your picture is in every departmental newsletter." "He works in the 3rd, I work downtown. We've probably been in the same room twice in the last 5 years at large department functions. I'm going to change my appearance, drastically. Shave my head, grow out my beard for a few weeks first. Different clothes, different way of talking. I'll be invisible." Jenkins stared at him, then a slow, determined nod. She saw the logic. She saw the necessity. The system was failing, so they had to step outside of it to fix it. It was a dangerous gambit, a leap of faith into uncharted territory for a department built on procedure and protocol. "Okay, Captain," she said finally, her voice steady. "I think you're completely insane, and I think it's the best idea I've ever heard. What do you need from me?" The relief that washed over Davis was immense. He wasn't alone in this. "I need a ghost," he said. "I need you to help me build a new identity, rig the vehicle, and be my eyes and ears on the outside. No one else can know. Not the chief, not the deputy chief. Not yet. This stays between us until it's over. If it works, we bring them the evidence. If it fails—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what failure meant. It meant his career. "It won't fail," Jenkins said with a conviction that bolstered his own. "Let's go catch a snake." The transformation of Captain Marcus Davis into Mark, the beleaguered taxi driver, was a masterclass in meticulous deception. It began not with a disguise, but with paperwork. The foundation of the entire operation had to be legitimate. Any hint of a fabricated identity could be used by Miller's lawyers to discredit the whole sting. So, Davis did it the hard way. He applied for a chauffeur's license through the city's official channels, using his own name and information. He filled out the forms, sat through the required safety class on a Saturday with a dozen other aspiring drivers, and passed the written exam. He submitted to the background check, knowing it would come back clean. 2 weeks later, a laminated official license arrived in the mail. Legally, he was now a taxi driver. Next came the vehicle. Jenkins, using a contact from her days in the auto theft unit, found a police auction that was selling off a handful of old, decommissioned Crown Victorias. They were former patrol cars, built like tanks but now past their prime. Davis paid cash for one using his personal savings. It was an anonymous white sedan, which he then took to a small, out-of-the-way body shop in a neighboring county. He paid the owner, a grizzled old man who asked no questions, a handsome sum to paint it a specific, unappealing shade of yellow and apply cheap, generic taxi decals to the side. He didn't want a slick, modern cab. He wanted something that looked worn, tired, and economically marginal, the kind of vehicle an officer like Miller would instinctively look down upon. While the car was being painted, Davis worked on himself. The departmental photo of Captain Davis showed a man with a neat, short haircut and a clean-shaven, professional face. That man had to disappear. He went to a barber shop far from his usual neighborhood and had his head shaved completely. The change was immediate and startling. It altered the shape of his face, making his features seem sharper, more severe. He had already spent the past month letting his facial hair grow, and now, instead of the neat beard he sometimes wore on vacation, he let it become a bit scruffier, less groomed. His wardrobe was the next to be overhauled. He packed away his tailored suits, his crisp uniform shirts, and his polished dress shoes. He and Jenkins went to a series of thrift stores, places far from the orbits of any cops they knew. He bought worn-out jeans, faded T-shirts with logos of bands he'd never listened to, and a simple, nondescript black jacket. He bought a pair of scuffed work boots. The clothes felt alien on his skin, but when he looked in the mirror, he saw the effect. The man looking back at him wasn't a police captain, he was just a guy trying to get by. The final piece of the physical transformation was his demeanor. For hours he would sit in his apartment practicing. He slouched his shoulders slightly, something his police academy instructors had drilled out of him 20 years ago. He worked on a different way of speaking, dropping the crisp, authoritative tone of a commander and adopting a more weary, slightly hesitant speech pattern. He practiced his new signature, a sloppier, less defined version of his own. Every detail, no matter how small, was considered and rehearsed. He was no longer just playing a part, he was inhabiting a new person, a person whose life and experiences were a world away from his own. One afternoon, Jenkins stopped by his apartment to check on his progress. He opened the door, and for a solid 3 seconds, she didn't recognize him. He was wearing the thrift store clothes. His head was shaved, and he simply stood there with the tired posture of a man who had just finished a long shift. She finally blinked, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Damn, Captain," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "If I didn't know it was you, I'd have told you to get lost. It's perfect." Davis just nodded, a grim sense of satisfaction settling over him. The deception was taking hold. He had forged a new identity, one designed for a single purpose: to be the perfect bait. Now all he needed was to make sure that when the trap was sprung, every single second of it was captured for the world to see. With the identity of Mark fully formed, the next phase of the operation was purely technical. The success of the sting didn't just depend on Captain Davis's performance, it depended on the irrefutable, undeniable evidence they could capture. This evidence had to be crystal clear, both in video and audio, and it had to be gathered by a system that was completely invisible. Officer Miller was paranoid and observant. A single misplaced wire or the telltale lens of a camera would blow the entire operation. Davis and Lieutenant Jenkins turned the beat-up yellow taxi into a high-tech surveillance hub. They worked at night in Jenkins's locked private garage, the space lit by harsh fluorescent bulbs. They had pooled their personal funds to purchase top-of-the-line miniature recording equipment online, the kind used by private investigators and journalists. This wasn't department-issued gear that could be traced or would require a chain of custody paperwork that could alert others. This was their own private insurance policy. The centerpiece of their system was a multi-camera setup designed to capture the encounter from every conceivable angle. The first camera was the most ingenious. It was disguised as a small, generic air freshener clipped to the dashboard. The lens was no bigger than a pinhole, yet it provided a wide-angle, high-definition view of the entire front of the car, perfectly framing the driver's side window where Miller would be standing. It would capture his face, his expressions, and his body language. The second camera was hidden inside a fake button on the car's center console. Its view was focused directly on Davis, capturing his reactions, his calm demeanor, and ensuring there could be no claim that he was provocative or aggressive. This was the driver's perspective camera, crucial for showing his side of the interaction. A third camera was embedded in the rearview mirror housing facing backward. It would record the initial moments of the traffic stop, the flashing lights of the patrol car, Miller getting out and approaching the vehicle. This would establish the context and disprove any potential lie Miller might invent about Davis's driving beforehand. Finally, a fourth camera, disguised as a small phone charger plugged into the rear power outlet, was aimed to cover the back seat and the passenger side window. This was for redundancy, ensuring that if Miller moved around the car, his actions would still be on tape. Audio was just as critical. They planted multiple high-fidelity microphones throughout the car's interior, one in the headliner, one in the driver's side door panel, and one near the gear shift. They tested them extensively, ensuring they could pick up a whisper from outside the window while filtering out most of the road noise. Every condescending word, every mumbled insult, every illegal order would be captured in pristine digital audio. All four cameras and the microphones were wired to a solid-state digital video recorder, DVR, hidden deep within the dashboard behind the glove compartment. It was a painstaking process of drilling small holes, snaking wires through the car's chassis, and ensuring everything was completely concealed. The DVR was motion-activated and could store over 100 hours of footage. It was powered directly by the car's battery, so there were no suspicious charging cables to be found. The final piece of the puzzle was Davis's own personal recording device. He would be wearing an official department-issued body camera, but not in the usual way. He wore an undershirt, and the camera was clipped to it, underneath his button-down shirt. A tiny slit, almost invisible in the fabric of his outer shirt, allowed the lens a clear view. He used a small piece of black electrical tape to cover the blinking red recording light. This was his ace in the hole. While the evidence from the hidden cameras was powerful, footage from an official police body camera was subject to even stricter rules of admissibility in a disciplinary hearing. Miller's lawyers could try to argue the taxi cameras were an illegal setup, but they could never dispute the footage from Davis's own official equipment. After 2 long nights of meticulous work, they were done. Jenkins sat in the driver's seat while Davis stood outside playing the part of Miller. They ran a full simulation, testing the angles and the audio. On the small monitor connected to the DVR, they watched the scene unfold from 4 different perspectives simultaneously. The quality was stunning. It was better than broadcast television. "It's like a movie set," Jenkins murmured, her eyes wide. "He'll have nowhere to hide. Every lie, every sneer, we'll have it all." Davis looked at the image on the screen, a clear shot of him standing by the window, his face a mask of authority. "That's the point," he said, his voice grim. "When this is over, the only story that will matter is the one the cameras tell." With the taxi prepped and his new identity solidified, Captain Davis knew there was one final, crucial step he had to take before targeting Officer Miller. The entire operation hinged on authenticity. He couldn't just look like a cab driver, he had to be one. Any hesitation, any unfamiliarity with the rhythm of the job could be a tell that would give him away. So for 2 solid weeks, Marcus Davis, the head of internal affairs, became Mark, the full-time taxi driver. He didn't just drive around aimlessly, he actually worked. He signed up for a popular ride-sharing app, using his newly acquired chauffeur's license and the taxi's registration. The app's algorithm began sending him real fares, real people who needed to get from one place to another. And with each ride, Davis shed a layer of his police captain persona and gained a deeper understanding of the city he had policed for 2 decades. He picked up a nurse from the city hospital at the end of her 12-hour shift, her body slumping into the back seat with exhaustion. She didn't say much, but he could feel her weariness, and he drove her home through the quiet streets with a silent sense of respect. He drove a young couple on a first date to a restaurant downtown, their nervous, excited chatter filling the cab. He took a businessman to the airport, the man barking into his phone about million-dollar deals the entire way, completely oblivious to the driver in the front seat. He learned the city from a new perspective, not as a grid of patrol zones and precinct boundaries, but as a living, breathing entity. He learned the best shortcuts to avoid rush-hour traffic, the locations of the all-night diners where other drivers gathered for coffee, and the unwritten rules of the taxi line at the train station. He felt the frustration of being cut off by an aggressive driver and the small victory of catching a string of green lights. But more importantly, he experienced what it was like to be a black man in a low-wage service job. He felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere. He saw the doors of expensive cars click locked as he pulled up next to them at a red light. He felt the dismissive glances from doormen at luxury apartment buildings. He endured the passenger who, upon seeing him, asked if he knew the area well, a question loaded with unspoken doubt. One afternoon, he was pulled over. Not by Miller, but by a different officer in a different precinct. The reason given was that one of his brake lights was supposedly out. Davis knew for a fact it wasn't. He checked the entire car meticulously every morning. The officer, a young white cop full of nervous energy, approached his window and asked for his documents. Davis complied calmly, his heart rate steady, treating it as an unplanned dress rehearsal. He was Mark, the weary cabbie. He answered the questions respectfully, but said little. The officer ran his license, found nothing, and let him go with a warning to get the light fixed. The entire stop was pointless, a minor harassment that served no purpose other than to exert authority. And as Davis pulled away, he wasn't angry. He was enlightened. He finally understood, in his bones, what the people filing complaints against Miller had felt. That feeling of powerlessness, the slow burn of injustice over a minor fabricated offense. The knowledge that you are being singled out not for what you've done, but for who you are. He had heard the stories for years in the sterile environment of his office, but living even a fraction of that reality for 2 weeks changed everything. It steeled his resolve. This operation was no longer just about catching one bad cop. It was about validating the experiences of every single person who had been unjustly targeted. It was about proving that their stories were real, that their humiliation mattered. He was no longer just a police captain trying to clean up his department. He was a man who had sat in the other seat, who had seen the city through a different pair of eyes, and who was now more determined than ever to hold one of its so-called guardians accountable for his sins. The 2 weeks of driving a cab had stripped away his professional detachment and replaced it with a cold, clear, and deeply personal sense of purpose. The day of the operation arrived with a crisp, clear sky. It was a Tuesday morning, just after the peak of the rush-hour traffic. The choice of time was deliberate. A bright, sunny day meant no shadows, no rain-streaked windows to obscure the camera views. It was a day for clarity. Captain Davis woke up before dawn, the familiar pre-operation adrenaline coursing through his veins, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. But this was different. He wasn't preparing to execute a search warrant or lead a raid. He was preparing to become a victim. He dressed carefully in his Mark uniform, the faded jeans, the worn t-shirt, the simple black jacket. He didn't look in the mirror for too long, not wanting to see the police captain staring back at him. Today, he had to be Mark, and Mark alone. Before leaving his apartment, he activated the hidden recording system in the taxi, checking the live feed on a small encrypted tablet. All 4 cameras were operational. The audio was crystal clear. He then activated his own body camera, concealing it beneath his shirt and ensuring the indicator light was covered. Every system was a go. He started his route on the edge of the 3rd precinct, miles away from Sterling Avenue. According to the shift schedules Jenkins had discreetly obtained, Officer Miller had just started his patrol. His known habit was to spend the first couple of hours of his shift cruising the main arteries of the precinct's wealthiest neighborhoods, looking for his targets. Davis had to make himself visible, but not too obvious. He drove with painstaking precision. He came to a full 3-second stop at every stop sign. He used his turn signals 100 feet before every turn. His speed never wavered more than 1 mile per hour above or below the posted limit. His hands were locked at the 10 and 2 position on the steering wheel. He was the most boring, law-abiding driver in the entire city. He was giving Miller absolutely nothing, no legitimate reason to pull him over, and that was the entire point. A stop under these conditions would, from the very beginning, be an act of pure prejudice. He entered Miller's territory around 9:30 a.m. He cruised down Sterling Avenue, the heart of the beast. He passed gleaming storefronts and elegant cafes. He drove past Miller's parked patrol car, seeing the officer inside watching traffic. Davis didn't look over, didn't make eye contact. He just kept driving, another anonymous cab in the city. He completed a large loop, a route that took about 20 minutes and passed Miller's position again. He was a fish, swimming slowly past a shark, waiting for it to take the bait. As he drove, he thought about the mindset of his target. Miller wasn't looking for crime, he was looking for dissonance. He was looking for things that he felt were out of place in his neighborhood. And a beat-up yellow taxi driven by a black man was, in Miller's worldview, profoundly out of place. It was an affront to the order he imagined he was protecting. Davis wasn't just baiting a cop, he was baiting a specific man's bigotry. It was on his 3rd pass, as he turned off Sterling onto a quiet residential street, that it happened. He had just passed Miller's cruiser again, and this time he saw it in his rearview mirror. The patrol car pulled out from the curb. It followed him for a block, its presence a heavy weight behind him. Davis's heart hammered against his ribs, but his breathing remained slow and steady. He kept his eyes forward, his hands on the wheel. He was ready. Then, the world behind him erupted in silent, flashing light. Red and blue strobes painted the interior of his cab. The trap was sprung. He took a steadying breath and pulled the taxi over to the side of the road, coming to a smooth, perfect stop. He put the car in park and rested his hands on the top of the steering wheel, making them clearly visible. He watched in the rearview mirror as Officer Dean Miller stepped out of his car, the morning sun glinting off his sunglasses, his posture radiating the aggressive confidence of a man who believed he was completely in control. Davis's own performance was about to begin. He was no longer a captain, he was just Mark, and Mark was about to have a very bad day. The crunch of Officer Miller's boots on the gravel shoulder was the only sound for a moment, each step a deliberate beat in a rhythm of intimidation. Captain Davis watched in the rearview mirror as Miller approached, his walk a confident swagger, his hand resting on his hip near his gun. This was not the cautious approach of an officer conducting a routine traffic stop. This was the advance of a man who had already passed judgment. Miller arrived at the driver's side window and, without a word, rapped his knuckles hard against the glass. It wasn't a knock, it was a summons. Davis took a calming breath and pressed the button, the window humming down into the door. The bright morning air filled the car, carrying the scent of freshly mown grass from a nearby mansion's lawn. "License and registration," Miller said. His voice was a flat, bored monotone, the voice of a man performing a task he found tedious but necessary. He didn't say hello. He didn't introduce himself or state the reason for the stop. It was a pure, unadorned command. He leaned down, his mirrored sunglasses making it impossible for Davis to see his eyes, but Davis could feel the weight of his scrutiny. Playing the part of Mark, the weary cabbie, Davis moved with a deliberate slowness. He knew that sudden movements were often used as a pretext for escalation. He reached for his wallet and the glove compartment with open palms, ensuring his hands were always in Miller's line of sight. "Good morning, officer," Davis said, his voice calm and respectful. "Was I speeding?" The question seemed to annoy Miller, a minor disruption to his script. "I'll ask the questions," he repeated, his tone sharper this time. "You were weaving, drifting in your lane back there on Sterling. Looks like you might be having trouble paying attention. License, registration, insurance. Now!" The accusation was a blatant lie. Davis had been driving with the precision of a machine. The car's hidden cameras would have a perfect, steady shot of the road ahead, proving he hadn't swerved an inch. This was the foundation of the case, a stop predicated on a falsehood. Davis simply nodded, as if accepting the flimsy pretext. He handed the documents out the window. Miller took them, his fingers brushing against Davis's in a way that felt like a dismissal. He glanced at the license. "Marcus Davis," he read aloud, his lips curling into a slight sneer. "You're a long way from downtown, Marcus." He shined his flashlight into the car despite the bright daylight, sweeping the beam over the empty passenger seats and the floor mats. It was another small act of dominance, a way of saying, "I can search wherever I want with my eyes." "Just doing my job, officer. Taking fares where they come," Davis replied, keeping his tone even. Miller let out a short, derisive snort. "Fares? In this neighborhood? The only people taking a cab like this around here are the maids and the gardeners. You dropping someone off?" The question was loaded, dripping with insinuation. Davis knew he had to answer truthfully but concisely. "No, sir. Just finished a drop at the train station. Was heading back to my usual zone." "Your usual zone," Miller repeated slowly, as if the words themselves were suspicious. He leaned against the car, a casual posture that was anything but. He was taking his time, drawing out the moment, making Davis wait. This was part of the psychological game. Make the person feel small, powerless, and scrutinized. "This cab, it's yours, or you work for a company?" "It's mine," Davis said. Miller grunted. He tapped the roof of the old Crown Victoria with his flashlight. "Seen better days, huh? You keeping it maintained? Brakes good? Lights all working?" "Everything's in perfect working order, officer," Davis said. His voice was steady, but he was building a slow burn of calculated patience. Each question, each condescending remark, was another piece of evidence, another nail Miller was hammering into his own coffin. The cameras were capturing it all. The officer's dismissive tone, the baseless line of questioning, the entire interaction built not on public safety, but on a foundation of pure, unadulterated prejudice. The inevitable encounter had begun, and it was playing out exactly as Davis had foreseen. All he had to do was keep his composure and let Miller do the rest. The traffic stop stretched on, moving beyond the realm of procedure and into a slow, deliberate exercise in harassment. Officer Miller wasn't running Davis's license, he was just standing there, leaning against the taxi, continuing his interrogation. The mid-morning sun was getting warmer, but the air around the two men felt cold. "So, what's your story, Marcus?" Miller asked, his tone shifting from official to mock conversational. "You live in the city?" "All my life," Davis replied simply. "Yeah? Which part?" Miller pressed, his question not one of genuine curiosity but of classification. He wanted to place Davis, to put him in a box that fit his preconceived notions. "The South Side," Davis answered truthfully. Miller nodded slowly, a knowing look on his face, though it was hidden behind the sunglasses. "Ah, the South Side. Of course." The implication was clear, a casual dismissal of an entire section of the city. "Must be a big change of scenery for you driving around here. We have different standards in this precinct." This was the first moment Davis decided to push back, ever so slightly. It was time to introduce the first clue, the first hint that he was not the simple, unassuming cab driver he appeared to be. "Are those standards in the official police manual, officer?" Davis asked. His tone was still respectful, but the question itself was sharp, precise. It was not the question a typical citizen, intimidated and nervous, would ask. It was a question that hinted at a knowledge of policy and procedure. Miller's posture stiffened slightly. It was a flicker of surprise, quickly masked by annoyance. "It's called proactive policing," he snapped. "Something you probably don't see much of in your part of town. We keep things clean here." He finally pushed himself off the car and walked back toward his patrol vehicle, Davis's license and registration still in his hand. Davis watched him go, his own heart beating a steady, controlled rhythm. That small question had been a test, and Miller had failed it, reacting with defensive aggression instead of recognizing the red flag. Davis sat in his cab and waited. And waited. A normal license check takes 2 to 3 minutes, 5 if the system is slow. Miller took 15. This was a deliberate tactic, a common tool of intimidation. Leave the person sitting, wondering, their anxiety building with each passing minute. Let them stew. Davis used the time to mentally review the encounter so far. The illegal pretext for the stop, the condescending, racially coded questions, the subtle admission of a different, unofficial standard of policing. The evidence was already piling up. Finally, Miller emerged from his cruiser. He walked back to the taxi, but this time his demeanor had changed. The bored arrogance was gone, replaced by a more focused, aggressive hostility. The license check had come back clean, which seemed to only anger him more. A clean record didn't fit his narrative. "All right, Mr. Davis," he said, the use of Mr. sounding more like an insult than a sign of respect. "Step out of the car." This was the next critical juncture. Step out of the car is an order that citizens are legally required to obey during a traffic stop. But Davis knew he had the right to ask for the reason. "For what reason, officer?" he asked, his voice still perfectly calm. This was the second clue, a direct procedural question. Miller's jaw tightened. "Because I'm giving you a lawful order to do so. Are you refusing?" He was already framing it as non-compliance, setting up his justification for a potential arrest. "I'm not refusing," Davis said, holding his hands up slightly where Miller could see them. "I'm just asking why. Am I being detained?" Third clue. The specific legal phrase, "am I being detained," is a massive red flag that the person you're dealing with knows their rights. It's a question that separates the average person from someone with legal or law enforcement knowledge. Miller, blinded by his own authority and growing frustration, missed it completely. "You're being detained for this investigation," Miller snarled. "Now get out of the vehicle before I pull you out." With slow, deliberate movements, Davis opened the door and stepped out onto the street. He stood up to his full height, his posture straight, his shoulders back. For the first time, he was no longer looking up at Miller, but meeting his gaze at eye level. The battle of wills was escalating, and Miller, convinced he was winning, had no idea he was being expertly led to the edge of a cliff. Standing on the pavement next to his yellow cab, Captain Davis felt the dynamic shift. He was no longer contained within the vehicle, a passive figure behind a pane of glass. He was on his feet on the same ground as Officer Miller, and the sun was warm on his shaved head. He kept his hands open and away from his body, a universal sign of non-aggression, though every fiber of his being was coiled with tension and focus. Miller walked a slow circle around him, looking him up and down, a predator sizing up its prey. "Turn around, put your hands on the roof of the car," he commanded. Davis complied without a word, placing his palms flat against the sun-warmed metal. He could feel Miller's presence behind him, close and menacing. Miller conducted a quick, rough pat-down, his hands slapping against Davis's legs, sides, and back. It was unnecessarily forceful, another small act of physical dominance. He found nothing but a wallet and a set of keys. "So, tell me again what you're doing here," Miller said, his voice close to Davis's ear. "Because I'm not buying this just driving through story." "There is no story, officer," Davis said, his voice calm and clear, directed at the hidden microphones in his shirt and the car. "I am a licensed taxi driver operating my vehicle in the city." Miller stepped back, his frustration palpable. He had a man with a clean license, a clean record, no weapons, and no contraband. He had no legal basis to hold him, let alone to escalate the situation further. But Miller's ego was now fully invested. He couldn't just let this man go. In his mind, letting Davis drive away would be a defeat. He needed to find something, anything, to justify the stop and validate his own suspicion. His eyes fell on the car itself. "I'm going to need to search your vehicle," Miller stated. It wasn't a request, it was a declaration. This was the moment the entire operation had been built toward. This was the precipice of illegality. A police officer cannot search a vehicle during a routine traffic stop without probable cause, a reasonable belief that a crime has been committed or that evidence of a crime is present in the vehicle. Miller had nothing. No smell of drugs, no visible weapons, no incriminating statements from the driver. Davis knew he had to make his refusal clear and unambiguous for the recording. He turned his head slightly to look at Miller. "Officer, do you have a warrant or probable cause to search my car?" he asked. The question was a formality, but a legally crucial one. Miller's face, which had been tight with anger, broke into a confident smirk. He thought he had Davis trapped. "My probable cause," he said, tapping his own temple, "is my training and experience. I see a suspicious vehicle in a high-value area, I have a duty to check it out. And your evasive answers are giving me all the cause I need." It was a complete fabrication, a textbook example of an officer inventing justification after the fact. But Davis had one more card to play. "Officer, I do not consent to a search of my property," he said, his voice ringing with a new and unfamiliar firmness. He used the precise legal phrasing. "I do not consent." This was the final line in the sand. Without consent and without probable cause, any search Miller conducted would be illegal. The evidence found would be inadmissible in court, the fruit of the poisonous tree. And for the purposes of an IA investigation, it would be a catastrophic violation of departmental policy and a citizen's constitutional rights. Miller's smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of pure rage. He had been challenged, his authority directly questioned and denied by a man he saw as his inferior. In that moment, all his training, all his knowledge of the law, was consumed by his prejudice and his ego. "I don't need your consent," Miller snarled, his voice low and dangerous. He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, show me out of the car with the suspect. I'll be conducting a vehicle search." He looked back at Davis, his eyes hidden behind the sunglasses burning with a triumphant fire. "You had your chance to do this the easy way." He had just made the single biggest mistake of his career. He had announced his intention to conduct an illegal search over a recorded police channel, and every hidden camera in the taxi was perfectly positioned to document his every move. The trap was no longer being baited. It was snapping shut. As Officer Miller spoke into his radio, a profound calm settled over Captain Davis. This was it. The final, irrevocable error. Miller had taken the bait and swallowed the hook, the line, and the sinker. The performance was over. It was time for the curtain to rise on a different kind of show. Miller gestured towards the curb with his flashlight. "You! Sit on the curb, now, and don't move." Davis didn't move. He simply turned his body slowly to face Miller directly. He stood straight, his shoulders squared, and the weary, slightly stooped posture of Mark, the cab driver, evaporated as if it had never been there. In its place was the unmistakable bearing of a man accustomed to command. He looked Miller directly in the eyes, or where his eyes would be, behind the reflective lenses. The sudden transformation was so complete, so jarring, that Miller actually took a half step back. The man in front of him was no longer the person he had been harassing for the past 20 minutes. The power dynamic in the air shifted, crackling like static electricity before a storm. "What did you say to me?" Miller demanded, his voice laced with confusion and a hint of unease. Davis didn't answer the question. Instead, he spoke in a new voice. It was the voice he used in briefing rooms and disciplinary hearings. It was a voice of absolute, unquestionable authority. "Officer Dean Miller," he said, each word clear and precise. "I believe your badge number is 7142, is that correct?" The blood drained from Miller's face. The mention of his badge number, spoken with such cold precision, was a complete shock. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He was completely wrong-footed, his brain struggling to process the sudden radical change in the situation. "You have conducted a traffic stop without legitimate cause," Davis continued, his voice like ice. "You have engaged in a pattern of harassing and bias-based questioning, and you have just declared your intent to conduct an illegal search of a private vehicle in direct violation of the Fourth Amendment and Departmental Policy 12.5. Miller's jaw worked silently. The bravado, the swagger, the aggression, it all melted away, replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. Who was this man? How could a cab driver from the South Side possibly know departmental policy codes? Then, Davis slowly, deliberately, reached inside his simple black jacket. For a split second, Miller's police instincts flared. "Hands! Show me your hands!" he yelled, his voice cracking with panic as he fumbled for his own weapon. But it wasn't a weapon that Davis produced. It was a small black leather wallet. He flipped it open. Gleaming in the bright morning sun was a polished gold badge. It wasn't the silver badge of a patrol officer. It was the gold badge of the command staff. Above the city seal, engraved in stark, clear letters, were the words, "Police Captain." And below it the name, Marcus Davis. In the small space underneath, a final terrifying detail, Internal Affairs Division. Davis held the badge out for Miller to see. "I think you and I need to have a conversation, officer," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "But we're going to have it back at the precinct, my office." Miller stared at the badge, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. The cab driver, Marcus Davis. Captain Marcus Davis. The head of IA. The man whose name was a quiet terror to every dirty cop in the city. He looked from the badge to Davis's face, the shaved head, the scruffy beard, and in a flash, he tried to reconcile it with the clean-shaven professional photo he'd seen in department emails. The pieces clicked into place with an audible, soul-crushing clang. He had been so arrogant, so sure of himself. He hadn't been pulling over a powerless cab driver. He had been pulling over his judge, jury, and executioner. The mirrored sunglasses suddenly seemed ridiculous. Slowly, with a trembling hand, Officer Miller reached up and took them off. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated terror. The power on that quiet, sun-drenched street had not just shifted. It had undergone a seismic, world-altering reversal. The 10-mile drive from the quiet, tree-lined street in the 3rd Precinct to the downtown headquarters was the longest, most agonizing journey of Dean Miller's life. The world outside the windows of his own patrol car seemed to mock him with its normalcy. People were jogging, walking their dogs, heading to lunch, their lives moving forward while his had just ground to a screeching, catastrophic halt. There was no arrest. There were no handcuffs. Captain Davis had simply said, "You will drive me back to the precinct, now." It was an order, and Miller, his mind still reeling in shock, had numbly complied. Davis sat in the passenger seat, the place usually reserved for a partner, but he was no partner. He was a silent, imposing presence, his gaze fixed forward, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He hadn't said another word since he had put his badge away. The silence was a suffocating torment. It was thick with everything that had not been said and everything that was about to be. Miller's hands, slick with sweat, gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. He kept replaying the entire stop in his head, every snide remark, every condescending question, every illegal demand. He had been so confident, so in control. Now he was nothing more than a chauffeur for the man who was about to end his career. He risked a sideways glance at Davis. The captain hadn't moved. He was just sitting there, the cheap black jacket and faded jeans a surreal contrast to the immense authority that now radiated from him. The disguise was gone, not because he had taken it off, but because the man underneath had re-emerged with such force that the clothes no longer mattered. Miller felt a wave of nausea. He had called this man Marcus. He had sneered at his home on the South Side. He had treated him like dirt on his shoe. What had he missed? The clues now seemed so obvious, so glaringly apparent in hindsight. The calm, precise questions. Am I being detained? Do you have probable cause? These weren't the questions of a typical cabbie. They were the questions of a cop. He had been so blinded by his own prejudice, so sure that a black man in an old taxi was an easy target, that he had ignored every single warning sign. His arrogance had made him deaf and blind. The police radio, which had been silent, crackled to life. "Dispatch to 7142. What's your status, officer?" Miller's throat felt like it was full of sand. He didn't know how to respond. He glanced at Davis. The captain gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Miller picked up the microphone, his hand shaking. 7142 is, I'm en route to headquarters, with a passenger. His voice was a strained, reedy thing he didn't recognize as his own. 10-4, the dispatcher replied, oblivious to the universe-altering drama unfolding in car 7142. As they pulled into the secure parking garage beneath the precinct headquarters, Miller felt a final, crushing sense of doom. He was bringing his own doom home. He parked the car in its designated spot and killed the engine. The resulting silence was even more profound than before. Davis finally turned his head and looked directly at Miller. For the first time, Miller saw the captain's eyes up close. They were cold, clear, and utterly devoid of pity. "We're going to my office," Davis said, his voice low and even. "Lieutenant Jenkins will be waiting for us, along with the deputy chief. It seems you're the subject of a formal internal affairs investigation, officer. And I have to say, the evidence against you is overwhelming." He opened the passenger door and stepped out, leaving Miller alone in the suffocating silence of his patrol car. For a full minute, Miller didn't move. He just stared at his own reflection in the darkened windshield, a pale, trembling ghost in a police uniform that suddenly felt like a costume he was no longer worthy of wearing. The journey was over. The reckoning was about to begin. The walk from the parking garage to the 4th floor felt like a perp walk, but worse. Miller was the perp, and his escort was the silent, imposing figure of the man he had just illegally detained. Every officer they passed in the hallway, every desk clerk, every detective seemed to stop what they were doing and stare. The news, unspoken and unconfirmed, traveled through the building with the speed of gossip. A patrol officer from the 3rd Precinct being personally escorted by the head of IA? Something big had just gone down. Captain Davis's office was exactly as he had left it, only now it felt like a tribunal. Lieutenant Jenkins stood by the window, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of grim satisfaction and professional neutrality. And sitting in one of the chairs facing the desk was Deputy Chief Reynolds, a veteran cop with 3 decades on the job and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. His presence confirmed Miller's worst fears. This wasn't just an IA complaint anymore. This was a command-level crisis. "Sit down, Miller," Reynolds said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't say, "officer." The omission was deliberate. Miller sank into the remaining chair, his body feeling heavy and disconnected. Davis walked behind his desk but remained standing, looming over him like a judge. "For the past 6 months, Deputy Chief," Davis began, addressing Reynolds but making sure Miller heard every word, "this division has received numerous consistent complaints about Officer Miller's conduct during traffic stops in the 3rd Precinct. Allegations of biased policing, harassment, and illegal searches. All of them, until today, have been impossible to definitively substantiate." Davis turned his attention to Miller. "You're very good with your body camera, officer. You know how to play the game. You know what to say and what not to say. You create your own narrative. But you didn't know about the other cameras today." He gestured to the large monitor on the wall behind his desk. Lieutenant Jenkins tapped a key on a laptop connected to it, and the screen flickered to life. It showed a 4-way split-screen view. The top left panel was from the dashboard air freshener, showing a crystal-clear shot of Miller at the driver's side window. The top right was the view from the center console, focused on Davis. The bottom left was the rear-view mirror camera, showing the initial stop. And the bottom right was Davis's own body camera footage. "We're going to watch the entire stop from the beginning," Davis said. "And you are not going to look away." The video began to play. The audio was pristine. Miller was forced to watch himself, to hear his own voice, dripping with condescension. "What's a taxi like this doing in this part of town?" He heard Davis's calm, reasonable questions and his own aggressive, dismissive replies. He watched himself lie about Davis drifting in his lane, a lie that was completely exposed by the steady, unwavering shot from the forward-facing camera. When the video reached the point where Davis asked if the different standards in the 3rd Precinct were in the police manual, Deputy Chief Reynolds let out a quiet, disgusted sigh. Miller flinched as if he'd been struck. He watched himself conduct the rough pat-down. He watched himself invent his training and experience as probable cause. He watched with a growing sense of horror as he sneered the words, "I don't need your consent." The man on the screen was arrogant, abusive, and unprofessional. The man on the screen was a bully hiding behind a badge. And the man was him. The video continued, showing the moment Davis revealed his own badge. The split-screen view captured the scene from 4 different angles, a symphony of Miller's own humiliation. It showed his face paling, his hands trembling, his entire world collapsing in a single devastating moment. When the video finished, the screen went black. The silence in the office was absolute. There were no excuses to be made. There was no narrative to spin. The truth, in high definition and crystal clear audio, had been laid bare for all to see. Davis finally sat down in his chair. He looked at the broken man in front of him. "Any corrections, Miller?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. "Anything on that video you'd like to dispute?" Miller shook his head, unable to speak. He couldn't meet anyone's gaze. He just stared at his own hands, which were now trembling uncontrollably. He had been so used to writing the reports, to creating the official version of events. Now, for the first time, he had been forced to watch the truth. And the truth had destroyed him. With the video evidence having played out in the crushing silence of the office, Deputy Chief Reynolds stood up. He was a man of few words, and he saw no need for a lengthy speech. The situation was clear. the transgression undeniable. He walked over and stood in front of Miller's chair, forcing the younger officer to look up at him. "Your badge and your service weapon," Reynolds said, his voice a low command. "Put them on the desk, now!" It was the moment every officer dreads, the ultimate symbol of being cast out. For Miller, it felt like being asked to surrender his own identity. His movements were slow, robotic. His hands fumbled with the clasp on his duty belt. The heavy belt, with its holstered pistol, cuffs, and magazines, felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He unbuckled it and, with a loud clatter, placed the entire rig on the polished surface of Captain Davis's desk. Then he reached for the badge on his chest. His fingers, clumsy with shock, struggled with the pin. Finally, it came free. He placed the silver shield next to the gun. It looked small and meaningless now. "As of this moment, you are on indefinite administrative suspension without pay," Reynolds stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Your access to all departmental buildings and systems is revoked. You will be escorted to your locker to clean it out, and then you will be escorted from this building. A formal hearing for your termination will be scheduled before the end of the week. Given the evidence I have just witnessed, I can assure you that the outcome is a foregone conclusion. You are finished as a police officer in this city." Miller's head swam. Suspension. Termination. It was all happening so fast, an unstoppable avalanche that he had started himself with a single, prejudiced decision that morning. "You have the right to union representation," Captain Davis added, his voice cutting in, cool and professional. "I advise you to get it. But I also advise you to be realistic. The video doesn't lie. It doesn't have a perspective. It just shows what happened. And what happened is a fireable offense. Multiple fireable offenses." Lieutenant Jenkins stepped forward and placed a single piece of paper on the desk in front of Miller. It was the formal notice of his suspension. "Sign it," she said. Miller picked up the pen, his hand shaking so badly he could barely form his own signature. The ink scratched across the paper, a permanent record of his disgrace. "This video," Davis continued, gesturing to the dark monitor, "is now official evidence in an IA investigation. It will be preserved. It will be shown to the review board. It will be shown to the district attorney to determine if criminal charges for official misconduct and violation of civil rights are warranted." Criminal charges. The words hit Miller like a physical blow. This wasn't just about losing his job anymore. This was about losing his freedom. He thought of all the people he had arrested, the smug satisfaction he felt as he put them in the back of his car. Now, he was the one facing the cold, impersonal machinery of the justice system. "But it was entrapment," Miller whispered, the word a desperate last-ditch defense. "He set me up." Deputy Chief Reynolds let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "Son, entrapment is convincing a man to do something he wasn't inclined to do. From where I'm sitting, Captain Davis just gave you enough rope, and you were more than happy to hang yourself with it. He didn't tell you to lie about his driving. He didn't tell you to harass him. He didn't tell you to conduct an illegal search. Those were your choices, your decisions. Now you get to live with them." Two uniformed officers, senior sergeants with impassive faces, appeared at the office door. They had clearly been waiting. "These officers will escort you," Reynolds said, a clear dismissal. As Miller stood up, his legs unsteady, he looked at Captain Davis one last time. He was searching for something in the captain's face, pity, anger, anything. But he found nothing. There was only a profound, unshakable resolve. Davis had not done this out of malice. He had done it out of necessity. He had become a sword of justice, swift and sharp, to cut out a cancer that was poisoning his department. And as Miller was led away, stripped of his badge and his pride, he knew that the wound he had suffered was entirely self-inflicted. The story of Captain Davis's undercover sting did not break on the evening news. It was not leaked to the press. Instead, it spread through the police department like a shockwave, a controlled detonation designed for maximum internal impact. Within 48 hours, every command officer, every sergeant, every training supervisor had been called in to watch the full, unedited video of the Sterling Avenue traffic stop. The message from the chief's office was blunt and clear. This is what we are hunting. This is what will no longer be tolerated. The effect was immediate and profound. The video became a legend, a cautionary tale whispered in locker rooms and during late-night shifts. It was a stark reminder that any citizen, in any car, at any time, could be more than they appeared. It forced a department-wide reckoning, prompting uncomfortable conversations about implicit bias and the subtle ways prejudice could manifest during a seemingly routine encounter. Officer Miller's name became synonymous with career suicide. His swift and decisive termination, which was finalized at a hearing that lasted less than 20 minutes, sent an unmistakable signal. The thin blue line would not protect officers who abused their power in this way. The culture had to change. In the quiet aftermath, Captain Davis found himself not with a sense of triumph, but with a heavy feeling of introspection. He had won. He had successfully removed a bad cop from the streets and proven a point. But the victory felt complex, tinged with a somber understanding of the system he served. He sat in his office, replaying the events in his mind, not the video, but the human moments, and found himself dissecting the psychology of the man he had brought down. Why had Miller acted that way? It wasn't just simple racism, though that was clearly the driving force. It was deeper. Miller was a man whose sense of self-worth was inextricably linked to his authority, to his control over his designated territory. In the affluent bubble of the 3rd Precinct, he wasn't just a cop, he was a gatekeeper. His prejudice was fueled by a profound sense of entitlement, a belief that he had the right to decide who belonged and who didn't. The arrival of Mark, a black man in a beat-up taxi, was an affront to that fragile sense of order. By harassing Davis, Miller wasn't just being a bigot, he was desperately trying to reinforce his own dominance, to put the world back into the neat, hierarchical boxes that made him feel secure and powerful. His aggression was a symptom of his own deep-seated insecurity. Davis wondered, could he have done anything differently? If he had simply relied on another formal investigation, Miller would have undoubtedly slipped away again, his performance of the perfect cop deflecting all accusations. Miller was too smart for the conventional tools of oversight. If he had sent another black officer undercover, a patrolman or a detective, Miller might have later claimed it was a personal grudge, a setup by a jealous colleague. The defense would have been weak, but it would have muddied the waters. No, the plan had to be this drastic. The staggering difference in rank between a patrol officer and the head of internal affairs was the key. It made the reveal so devastatingly absolute that it left no room for excuses or conspiracy theories. The power of his own position was the only weapon strong enough to guarantee a clean, undeniable result. He had to become the target himself to protect all the future targets who didn't carry a captain's badge in their pocket. The story serves as a stark reminder that a badge is not a crown, and a patrol car is not a throne. It is a symbol of public trust, a trust that is fragile and easily shattered by the very people sworn to uphold it. Real strength is not found in the power to intimidate the vulnerable, but in the courage to hold the powerful accountable. Captain Davis didn't just expose a bad cop, he held up a mirror to the entire system and forced it to confront an ugly truth. The path to true justice is often fraught with risk and requires leaders who are willing to step out from behind their desks and walk a mile in the shoes of those they serve. Only then can they truly understand the weight of the shield they carry. What do you think? Was Captain Davis's elaborate sting a necessary act of justice, or did it cross a line into entrapment? What steps do you believe can be taken to ensure accountability and prevent officers like Miller from abusing their power in the first place? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe in stories where justice prevails, please consider subscribing for more.